Yeah, g'day mate. Not sure why YouTube removed that last video. Boom. But that happens, and going to deal with the real world here. Couldn't even figure out a way to appeal the decision, but I want to go back to this terrific book called Not God, History of Alcoholics Anonymous. So here in this kitchen in November 1934, dark November afternoon, a seed was planted in Bill Wilson's own understanding that his alcohol-numbed brain could neither then drown nor later wash away, the seed that he eventually nurtured and cultivated into the core of the program in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, in the kinship of common suffering. One alcoholic had been talking to another. So let me play a bit from Craig's AA share.
And she's such a fucking Al-Anon, she'd go, okay, that's fine, You know, I didn't, you know, just because there wasn't enough of me, I had to make up more stuff about me. There wasn't enough of me. You know, I had to make it more exciting. So I'd been to prison. I used to, in my first AA meetings, in the first 6 months, I used to talk about my heroin use. I've never fucking used heroin. But I used to like, oh, the needles and you know, and that's, I mean, I could have used it. It's not like, but I didn't. I just, and it wasn't for any political reason either that I mentioned that. I mean, I used a lot of other drugs. I didn't, you know, when I was out there say, no thanks, no cocaine for me. It'll mean a different 12-step program when I get sober. You know, I was just fucking, fine, I'll take it, whatever, you know. I just didn't hang about with that many people that had heroin. The truth of it, you know. Didn't know where you bought it. And I certainly wasn't going to cross town and leave a warm bar to buy fucking a drug I'd never really heard of that much. Why? The bar's open. You know, why leave? But after, when I went to the treatment centre and I stopped drinking, and I kind of, they asked me questions that I didn't understand. They asked me, how do you feel? I swear to God, I didn't understand what the fuck they were talking about. I kid you not, I don't, it's how do you feel? So I would wait until, it was like group therapy. And I would wait until other people in the group said things and I would say what they said. Or say what somebody said yesterday. So I...
Okay, back to this terrific book from 1991. So sometime in 1931, another man, a young, talented, and wealthy financial wizard, found himself on the verge of despair over his inability to control his drinking. Having attempted virtually every other cure, he turned to one of the greatest medical and psychiatric talents of the time, traveling to Zurich, Switzerland, to place himself under the care of Dr. Carl Gustav Jung. Close to a year, Roland Hazard worked with Carl Jung, finally leaving treatment with boundless admiration for the physician and almost as much confidence in his new self. To his consternation, Roland Hazard soon relapsed into intoxication. Certain that Jung was his last resort, he returned to Zurich and the psychiatrist's care. There followed, in Bill Wilson's words written to Dr. Jung in 1961, the conversation between you and Roland Hazard that was to become the first link in the chain of events that led to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. That conversation had made 2 points. First of all, you frankly told him of his hopelessness so far as any further medical or psychiatric treatment might be concerned. Second, in response to Roland Hazard's frantic query whether there might be any other hope, Jung had spoken of a spiritual or religious experience, in short, a genuine conversion, cautioning, however, that, well, such experiences had sometimes brought recovery to alcoholics. They were comparatively rare. This candid and humble statement of yours was beyond doubt the first foundation stone upon which our society has since been built. And as a result, Roland Hazard joined the Oxford Group, an evangelical movement then at the height of its success in Europe. Oxford Group was trying to practice first-century Christianity, a big emphasis on the principles of self-survey, confession, restitution, and giving of service to others. Within the Oxford Group, Roland Hazard, this successful American businessman, found the conversion experience that released him for the first time from his compulsion to drink. Turning to New York City, he joined, became active in the Oxford Group, And there in August 1934, hearing that his old friend Ebby Thatcher was threatened with a commitment to an institution because of his drinking, Roland Hazard intervened, pledged for Ebby's parole, leading him to the Oxford group, and so to Ebby's first period of sobriety. So Ebby Thatcher did indeed get the message, accepting that his only hope lay in a conversion experience, that such was the function of religion, and the Oxford group was the most famed and most respectable evangelical expression of religion in America at that time. He joined and found a friendship and fellowship he had never known before, and in the flush of confident enthusiasm, hallmark of any experience of conversion, Ebby in turn sought out the most hopeless and his most self-destructive drinker that he knew, his old friend, Bill Wilson. And the judgment and feeling were mutual. Bill Wilson had long since marked Ebby as an utterly hopeless drunk, and Bill had promised himself that he would stop drinking if he ever got as bad as Ebby Thatcher.
I said vulnerable a lot. How do you feel vulnerable? And then I got a bit ballsy. I was getting a bit more sober, so I'd start to make stuff up like hungry. Horny, actually. I've been in treatment for 2 months. I want fucking out of here. You know, and it was, but I didn't know that. I had no idea. It was a very slow process for me, kind of putting any of this together. I don't even know if I've got much of it going now, but I haven't had a drink for 6 years, and anybody who knows me, that's impossible for me. I can't do that. I don't know how that's really happened, but I come up here and I'll tell you about it because it has happened. And I can't really explain it. I've got lots of, I mean, some days I think it's about, you know, God and the baby Jesus, and other days I think it's about, you know, something more Zen and a bit more kind of West Coast. And other days I think it's like, I don't know, it's me. You know, these are very bad days when I think it's me.
Okay, so when Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, was a kid, it was really important to him to become the number one man. So that was the story of his alcoholism. On the other, it was the source of Alcoholics Anonymous, a fitting irony. His first success as a kid was the fashioning of a boomerang. He had few friends growing up. He felt himself awkward around other people, so he accidentally discovered alcohol, and discovered with alcohol that he then became much more at ease with others. And eventually went to law school, became a stock speculator, but drink eventually got the better of him. So Bill Wilson told his biographer Robert Thompson that when he first drank alcohol, he could feel his body relaxing, a stiffness going out of his shoulders as he sensed the warm glow seeping through himself into all the distant, forgotten corners of his being. Soon he had the feeling that he wasn't the one being introduced, that people were being introduced to him. He wasn't joining groups. Groups were forming around him. It was unbelievable, and at the sudden realization of how quickly the world could change, he had to laugh, and he couldn't stop laughing. It was a miracle. There was no other word. Miracle that was affecting him mentally, physically, and spiritually. And as he looked around at other people, he realized they were not superior beings to him. They were his friends. They liked him. He liked them. He felt little waves of joy running through him. His world was made new, made fresh. He felt himself moving easily and gracefully through life. In comparison, all his previous life had been living in chains. Now he was free. So that was his experience with his first drink. And he then devoted a lifetime trying to recapture that elusive and ultimately elusive sensation of freedom. He was drinking to dream great dreams of great power, of becoming the number one man. So we pick up these compulsions or addictions, these substances or processes, because at first they work. It could be just daydreaming, fantasizing. It gets us out of feeling miserable. Immediately we feel happy because we've learned to daydream and to fantasize. But what starts out as an adaptive practice becomes maladaptive. Then he was repeatedly sent to Charles B. Towns Hospital, a drying out facility on Central Park West. He was admitted 4 times in 1933 to 34. Came under the care of Dr. William Duncan Silkworth. Became immortalized in AA lore as the little doctor who loved drunks. According to Dr. Silkworth, Bill's alcoholism was an illness. One look at him. It'd be obvious. Bill Wilson had become physically allergic to alcohol, yet his mind remained obsessed with it. So you have an addiction when you feel compelled to participate in your own destruction. Once he had the first drink, he couldn't necessarily reliably control how many more drinks he had. So on his last time in the sanitarium, he had this spiritual experience where he felt like a divine wind was blowing through him, and he no longer had any desire to drink. So that was the vital spiritual experience that began his recovery. You record, my depression deepened unbearably. When I was in that sanitarium the final time, it seemed like I was at the bottom of the pit. I gagged badly on the notion of a power greater than myself, but finally, just for the moment, the last vestige of my proud obstinacy was crushed. All at once, I found myself crying out, if there is a God, let him show himself. I'm ready to do anything. And I got to that stage when I was bedridden with chronic fatigue syndrome. This kind of giving up on my own way. Okay, let me find God. Suddenly, the room lit up with a great white light. I was caught up into an ecstasy which there are no words to describe. It seemed to me in the mind's eye that I was on a mountain and that a wind, not of air but of spirit, was blowing. Then it burst upon me that I was a free man. Slowly the ecstasy subsided. I lay on the bed, but now for a time I was in another world, a new world of consciousness. All about me and through me, there was a wonderful feeling of presence, and I thought to myself, so this is the God of the preachers. Great peace stole over me, and I thought, no matter how wrong these things seem to me, they are all right. Things are all right with God and his world. Then Bill worried if he was having hallucinations, so he went to see Dr. Silkworth, related everything that happened. Dr. Silkworth asked him some questions, and finally said, you're perfectly sane, in my opinion. Whatever's happened to you is better than what you've had previously. Hang on to it. It is so much better than what you had only a couple of hours ago. The next day, more light dawned, and Bill remembered that Ebby Thatcher had recommended to him the William James book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And what Bill Wilson got from this book was to prove significant to the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. Spiritual experience, William James taught, could have objective reality, almost like gifts from the blue. They could transform people. Some were sudden, brilliant illuminations. Others came on very gradually. Some flowed out of religious channels. Others did not. But nearly all had the great common denominators of pain, suffering, calamity. Complete hopelessness and deflation at depth were almost always required to make the recipient ready. The significance of all this burst upon me. Deflation at depth. Yes, that was it. Exactly that had happened to me. Deflation at depth, that's the basis of recovery.
But I don't know. I know that when I stop going to meetings, I get so crazy that I just might drink. And that I've experienced a level of comfort, sober, by working the steps that I never thought possible. That only I'd experienced in fleeting moments, just when the alcohol was about right, and and everything was about right. That about half-hour period in a week when I would get that. But I kind of feel comfortable quite a lot of the time. A lot of the time I don't feel comfortable, and I go to meetings. About six or 7 months ago, I started to experience panic attacks, which I'd never really had before, in sobriety. I'd had them Fuck it. You know, I'd had amphetamines. I know what a panic attack is, but I mean, I never really had them, and I got really, really scared. And I thought I needed more than AA. And I started making investigations. I went to some doctors and asked about certain medications that would maybe help me. I went to a doctor who was in AA. I started doing a lot of different things. I was kind of looking around. When I look at it now, I kind of think I was...
So I'm looking at New York Review of Books, January 15, 2009 issue, headline, Drug Companies and Doctors, A Story of Corruption. By Marcia Engel. She reviews 3 books. 1, Side Effects, a prosecutor, a whistleblower, and a best-selling antidepressant on trial. Next story, Our Daily Meds, how the pharmaceutical companies transformed themselves into slick marketing machines and hooked the nation on prescription drugs. And the last book, Shyness, how normal behavior became a sickness. Here are just 4 paragraphs from this article. Consider the clinical trials by which drugs are tested in human subjects. Before a new drug can enter the market, its manufacturer must sponsor clinical trials to show the Food and Drug Administration that the drug is safe and effective, usually as compared with a placebo or dummy pill. The results of all the trials are submitted to the FDA, and if only 1 or 2 drug trials are positive, just 1 or 2 trials show effectiveness without serious risk, the drug is usually approved, even if all the other trials are negative. So they could have 10 negative trials, but if they do 1 or 2 positive trials, the FDA approves the drug. Drugs are approved only for a specific use, but physicians may prescribe approved drugs off-label without regard to their specified uses, and perhaps as many as half of all prescriptions are written for off-label purposes. After drugs are on the market, companies continue to sponsor clinical trials, sometimes to get FDA approval for additional uses, sometimes to demonstrate an advantage over competitors, and often just as an excuse to get physicians to prescribe such drugs for patients. Since drug companies do not have direct access to human subjects, they need to outsource their clinical trials to medical schools, where researchers use patients from teaching hospitals and clinics, or they go to private research companies, which CROs. They're usually faster. But drug companies prefer medical schools because the research is taken more seriously, and also because it gives them access to highly influential faculty physicians, referred to by the pharmaceutical industry as thought leaders or key opinion leaders. These are the people who write textbooks and medical journal papers, issue practical guidelines, treatment recommendations, sit on FDA or the governmental advisory panels, head professional societies, and speak at the innumerable meetings and dinners that take place every year to teach clinicians about prescribing drugs. So a few decades ago, medical schools did not have extensive financial dealings with the pharmaceutical industry. Faculty investigators who carried out industry-sponsored research generally did not have other ties to the sponsors, but schools now have their own manifold deals with the industry and hardly in a moral position to object to their faculty behaving in the same way. 2/3 of academic medical centers hold equity interest in drug companies that sponsor research within the same institution. 2/3 receive departmental income from drug companies, 3/5 receive personal income. So, a little bit about how the pharmaceutical industry works.
I was sniffing around for something. I was kind of like that fucking little thing in me was looking for something, and I went to I wanted fixed. I wanted cured. I was tired of coming to these fucking meetings all the time. I wanted something to take it away, and I went to this woman who massages your aura. I was desperate, you know. I'm serious. She does things with your aura. You lie down and you don't take your clothes off or anything, so fuck, what are you paying for, right? And you lie in this thing and she does some stuff, and I'm sure if it works for you, great. It didn't seem to do much for me. And at the end of it, when I was paying for it at the end, she said, now just write something chiropractic so that you can claim it on your insurance from the check. And I thought, doesn't that fuck with your aura? Doesn't that? What happens to your aura when you start fucking, you know, a wee lies here, a couple of wee things here? It's okay. I've got my aura. I don't know. I think for some people an aura is a very good thing. I think for me it's suicidal to have an aura. For me an aura is a very bad thing to have. I shouldn't have any auras.
Okay, here's a video compilation of recent attacks on Jews in New York City. Okay, so YouTube has no problem with me talking about attacks on Jews in New York City, but if I tell you about the group that's carrying out most of these attacks, they'll delete my video like that, give me a strike, just like that. If I tell the truth, YouTube will just delete my video like this. Okay, YouTube has an agenda. It only does what the Anti-Defamation League tells it to. So this is really directives that come from the Anti-Defamation League. So yes, you are welcome to talk about attacks on Jews in New York City, New Jersey, but you're not allowed to talk about the group that's carrying out the attacks on Jews. They'll just boom, boom, boom. You'll just be gone, just like this. So to remain on YouTube and deal with any issues of substance, you have to lie either by commission or omission. That's the price for being on YouTube. If I were to tell you the truth about who's carrying out these attacks, boom, I'm gone. My channel's gone. Thousands of videos are gone. All right, so if I was to blame the attacks on Donald Trump, I could do that all night long. If I blame the attacks on white people, on neo-Nazis, on Christians, I could do that all night long. But if I was to correctly identify the protected group that's carrying out these attacks on Jews in New York and New Jersey, then YouTube's just going to delete my video, give me a strike. So those are the boundaries in which I'm operating on. YouTube will delete comments in the chat if you name who's actually carrying out these anti-Jewish attacks, and they can catch you. We're not allowed to talk about who's actually carrying out these attacks on Jews. YouTube will remove you for that, just like if you simply mention the name of the whistleblower or put his face on your YouTube channel, YouTube will delete your video, boom, and possibly even your channel. So that's what we're dealing with, and that's reality. Let's hear a little bit from Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous.
With us tonight. Please welcome Bill W. Bill.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm late, folks. Well, it was a chance that we weren't going to even get here tonight. I understand some of you in the hall already know what has happened today, but it's come as a terrible shock. And well, here, let me read the telegram that we received 1 o'clock this afternoon. Dear Uncle Bill, well, it's addressed to William G. Wilson, the Alcoholic Foundation, New York, New York. Dear Uncle Bill, Dad slipped away peacefully at noon today at the Akron Hospital. We'll call you later with the funeral arrangements. Our love to you and Aunt Lois. And it's signed Sue and Bob Jr. Dr. Bob, my partner, your friend, our friend, died today. As I said, I wasn't going to come, but Lois, my wife, said, what better place could you come to than a meeting of Bob's friends? I also got a call from Ed Dowling, Father Ed down in St. Louis, and he said, go. He said, go. It'll do you a lot of good. He said, just don't talk about yourself. Talk about Bob. Talk about the beginning. Tell our story. Don't just tell your story. He said, make it an Irish wake. And thinking about that, I decided that I would come, and I will share with you. So please, if I'm a little out of kilt here, just realize that I got some tragic news today. I did, though, on the way over, take a minute to jot down a few notes to sort of commemorate the events of this group's anniversary. And with your permission, I'd like to get that out of the way before we begin the meeting. We meet tonight to celebrate the...
And I just want to share with you what happened with my last video. YouTube deleted the video. Then they said, oh, but you can appeal it. They deleted it for spam, okay? They said you can appeal it. I didn't delete the video. YouTube deleted the video, but here they put content deleted by user. It's a lie. Did not delete the video. Why would I delete my own video? But YouTube lies. I think we all know that. YouTube demands that one lie to continue to have a presence on YouTube, either lie by commission or omission. I did not delete my own content. This is a lie by YouTube. So just thought I'd give you kind of an idea what I'm dealing with here. YouTube has an agenda, left-wing agenda. They've changed their algorithm to promote left-wing videos. Anything that dissents from their company line very much in danger to get deleted, and that's reality.
This group's anniversary, first anniversary in the life of Dr. Bob Smith. We thank God that he has freed many of us out of bondage, and we're here to tell all our friends of our deep gratitude for all the help they have given us in this wholesale miracle of recovery, and to share with them and with each other the sure evidence of God's grace among us. So much for speech making. We don't make speeches, we just tell our stories. Tonight, though, it'll be a little bit different. It'll be our story. Well, let me see, where do I begin? I guess for us, for me anyway, the beginning was 16 years ago, 1934, the end of the summer, September. I was a patient up in Charlie Towns' hospital, up on Central Park West. I had been a patient there before. This was my fourth visit, third time that year. And I was upstairs, wrapped up in one of Charlie's canvas pajama tops. You remember the ones that tied in the back? And my wife, Lois, she was downstairs. She was talking to Dr. Silkworth, and he was telling her what he had just maybe an hour or so before told me. He was telling her that my drinking, which had once been just a habit, had now become an obsession, and that my body at last had developed an allergy to the very substance that I craved, and that I was dying, and that I was an alcoholic. He had this concept, this theory, after treating thousands of men like myself, that mine was a disease as any other disease, and a disease that was sure to kill me if I was left to my own. And it was his earnest suggestion that Lois commit me into the Rockland State Hospital for the insane. You could do that then as a chronic inebriate, and he wanted to do that because he knew I was killing myself. But all Lois could say is, but doctor, you don't understand. I never met a man like Bill who, when he made his mind up, could do anything. Why can't he stop this drinking? And again, he repeated, he has a disease, hard to understand, harder to treat, but a disease nevertheless. And that he better follow his advice. Lois, of course, was distraught, and I was upstairs going over those words myself, and I was just as distraught, just trying to say, why me? You know, typically alcoholic, why me? Why did this happen to me? And I went back over my life, and I could see certain events perhaps that brought me on the road to it, but why me? I did not set out to be this way. Perhaps if I looked for a reason, was the fact that my father had a problem with alcohol. That was the reason for my parents' divorce when I was 8 years old. My sister and I and my mother were abandoned by my father as a result of his drinking. My mother left shortly. I was made to live with my grandparents, my mother's parents. My grandfather instilled in me at an early age a strong, strong desire to be number one. And I guess the capstone of all of that was, at 12, in my earnest rush to be number one, I invented, or was in the record books as an inventor, the first American boomerang. I had gotten a book from Grandpa when I was 12 on my birthday that, in passing it to me, he said, you know, the Aborigine is the only fellow that can make a boomerang. And I just went after that tooth and nail to prove that I could be an equal to an Aborigine. And after 6 months, a 6-month power drive, I created the first boomerang. It worked. From that day on, my grandfather started it off. I was a number one man in his eyes, and as far as he was concerned, in everybody else's eyes. Little realizing at the time that I was setting up an emotional boomerang that was going to last me the rest of my life. The need to be number one in everything I did. So perhaps that was the reason for my turning alcoholic. I only drank for 17 years. Picked up my first drink when I was 22 in the Army. Stationed up in Massachusetts with my wife. 17 years later, I'm lying in a hospital bed, an alcoholic. Made a fortune in those 17 years and lost it. Not much to my fault, but some of it, but a lot of it due to the crash in 29. That began the in and outs of the institutions, because when that happened, I also crashed, and I was a hopeless drunk. A lot of problems with alcohol. In and out of sanitariums, trying out places, hospitals, rest homes. Lost everything we had. Everything. Now here I am, 39 years old, and the doctor wants to put me in the hospital for the rest of my life. So I begged Lois not to follow his advice. When she came to see me, I begged her to give me one more chance, and God bless her, she did, and she brought me home to our home. In reality, it wasn't our home, it was my brother-in-law's. We were living rent-free over in Clinton Street in Brooklyn Heights. Lois had a job in a downtown Brooklyn department store making $22 a week. Everything we had that was of any value had been sold long before this. And I was a chronic drunk. But she brought me home anyway, and she gave me that one last chance. And in the next 2 months, I proved the doctor wrong. Totally, absolutely wrong. I didn't leave the house, but I got sober. Stark raving sober, I guess you'd call it, but I got sober. After 2 months of just staying inside that house, I knew that the doctor had made a mistake. I was not an alcoholic. I was not a drunk. And then, Armistice Day, 1934, a beautiful, smashing day. Positively brilliant. I looked out the window after breakfast and seeing how great it was, I said to my wife, Lois, I said, honey, I want to play some golf today. This is perhaps the last good day of the year, and I want to get in a round of golf before winter sets in. I felt like $1 million. And she tried to stop me as best she could. She said, Bill, get stronger, but I insisted. And finally, she relented, and she gave me a few dollars, and I went up to the attic, and I dug out the old golf bag, and walked down to the Staten Island ferry. The club was open in Staten Island. Actually, it was my brother-in-law's club. I could play, and he paid. I walked to the ferry, took the ride over, and as I said, it was a positively beautiful day, and I felt like $1 million. On the other side, I boarded the bus to take me to the clubhouse, and I'm getting on the bus, I noticed a fellow that was carrying a rifle. Now, I don't know about you, but in New York, if I see somebody with a gun, I want to keep a good eye on him. So I decided the best thing for me to do was to sit alongside him. And after a few stops, I said to him, hey, mister, where are you going with that rifle? And he just told me, I'm going to a shooting match. And as it turned out, it was at a gun club right next door to the very golf course that I was going to play on. There was this gun club, and he was going to shoot that afternoon. Now, having raised in Vermont, I fancied that I knew everything there was about rifles, and I began to tell him everything I knew. As it turned out, he knew a lot more than I did, so at the end of it, just to be number one in the conversation, I threw in what I knew about the artillery, having been in the artillery during the First World War. And lo and behold, I became number one in the conversation. He was impressed. Now, we were settling down for a very comfortable ride when all of a sudden the bus was rear-ended by a taxicab. We had to unload to see the damage, and it wasn't much, just a few bumps and bruises, but nothing of any significance. But it was sufficient that the bus driver, had to wait to make out a police report, so they called for a replacement bus to continue the trip. Well, we're standing on the curb, my newfound friend and I, when he spots an old speakeasy across the street. He says to me, why don't we wait there? He said, it'll be a lot more comfortable, and the driver can come for us when the new bus...
Okay, so there are a lot of great Bill W. clips on YouTube, which I found a tremendous source of inspiration and strength. To get in a little bit of Herb K. speaking on the 8th tradition of
Good evening, my name is Herb, and I'm an alcoholic.
The third paragraph, and they talk about paid...
The healing circuit meditation. Did I? No, no. Okay, I'll bring it in because it's a takeoff on a meditation. Excuse me. It's a meditation taking off from Bill Wilson's article in 1958 on emotional sobriety. He has a phrase in there, and it's really dense, about the healing circuit. Well, that phrase really intrigued me in the context of emotional sobriety, so I spent some time really meditatively unpacking it, and a meditation came out. I'll bring it in next week, which is very relevant to this, the healing circuit, that level of energy that is the life of spirituality. I think Nicole was, no, okay, just standing. Go on, George.
Hi, George Barrel, alcoholic again. Nor does any AA like to be told just how he must handle that new prospect of his. You know, and my sponsor told me that there were many different ways to take people through the steps.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, just, you know, he did it the way his sponsor did it.
Exactly.
But I've actually developed my own way, which is...
And that's appropriate.
You know, I've been through the steps a few times, and it's kind of a melange of the different methods.
Yep, that's exactly.
Okay, so Mark Klein of the Zionist Organization of America has tweeted, ADL survey shows that 34% of blacks are anti-Semitic, only 9% of whites are anti-Semitic. Something must be done. We must find out why in the black community there are 4 times as many anti-Semites as in the white community. Is it their leaders, Farrakhan, Sharpton, Jackson, Reverend Wright, etc.? Okay, so I don't agree with Martin Klein. I don't think that figure is accurate. I think that white people are more likely to hide what they think, to understand that you're not allowed to say, for example, that Jews enjoy a lot of influence in Hollywood or in parts of the news media. So whites are more politically correct in general, not just with regard to Jews. I think that what the ADL calls, you know, huge rates of anti-Semitism in the black and Latino community, that much of it is just that blacks and Latinos are not as politically correct, that they haven't accepted the conditioning that you're not allowed to notice things. So according to many people in the professional anti-Semitism game, where they make their income from crying oy vey about anti-Semitism, to even notice reality, to notice patterns, that in and of itself is anti-Semitic. And I think blacks and Latinos, by and large, are less likely to be browbeaten into not saying out loud what most people notice and think. And I think that, at least in part, accounts for these differing levels of putative anti-Semitism.
My experience, my sponsor took me through, my sponsor gave me directions on the steps in my first year. He never took me through the steps. He said, do them. And he showed me the books to do it from. And of course, I didn't know what I was doing, so it didn't have much effect. But then 5 years later, I found a man who literally walked me through each page, each step in the big book. And that was the beginning of my experience. But then 3 years later, another man, another set of instructions, 85% the same, but 15% different. And then 3 years later, I went through it with another man, and about 80% the same, 20% different. But I made notes of all of these trips. And then as I began doing the workshops and basing my workshops on my own experience, which was an amalgam of all of those instructions, then it began to be obviously codified into what is now the workbook or the guidebook.
Hey, I want to talk about a terrific book that I read a few months ago. It just came out, called Mind Fixes Psychiatry's Troubled Search for the Biology of Mental Illness. So Mind Fixes tells the history of psychiatry's quest to understand the biological basis of mental illness and asks where we need to go from here. Mind Fixes, Anne Harrington, author of The Cure Within, explores psychiatry's repeatedly frustrated struggle to understand mental disorder in biomedical terms. She shows how the stalling of early 20th century efforts in this direction allowed Freudians and social scientists to insist with some justification that they had better ways of analyzing and fixing minds. When the Freudians overreached, they drove psychiatry into a state of crisis that a new biological revolution was meant to alleviate. And Harrington shows how little that biological revolution had to do with breakthroughs in science, why the field of psychiatry has fallen into a state of crisis in our own time. Mind Fixes makes clear that psychiatry's waxing and waning biological enthusiasms have been shaped not just by developments in the clinic and lab, but also by a surprising range of social factors, including immigration, warfare, grassroots activism, and assumptions about race and gender. Government programs designed to empty the state mental hospitals, accurate rivalries between different factions in the field, industry, profit-mongering, consumerism, and an uncritical media have all contributed to the story as well, focusing particularly on the search for the biological roots of schizophrenia, depression, and bipolar disorder. And Harrington underscores the high human stakes for the millions of people who have sought medical answers for their mental suffering. It's not just a story about doctors and scientists, but about countless ordinary people and their loved ones. So, as I mentioned earlier, drug companies only need to show 1 or 2 successful trials to get a drug approved by the FDA. They could have 10 unsuccessful trials, but they can keep that hidden from the public. And in the final analysis, drugs like Prozac only have a slightly better rate of success than simply the placebo effect. And what they do have definitively is that they diminish the size of the prefrontal cortex, that they do varying amounts of damage to the mind. Though there are some drugs that have been very useful for some people, such as lithium. I benefited from about 7 years on lithium. But I was able to drop it along with clonidine and clonopam when I was about 6 weeks into my daily Alexander Technique teacher training. Not saying that will work for everyone. That's just my experience.
And there was a point that you made. Oh, and I have personalized it, of course, because not only did I receive their instructions, but I had my experience, and a different experience each time, and so that has colored my my instructions, my own experience. And that's what you were saying. Yeah. Yeah, please.
You know, a lot of working the steps is not just reading out of the big book, but embellishing that with my own particular personal experience in various of these areas.
Embellishing isn't a word I would embrace, but I understood the spirit of it.
Yes, and you know, much of my current approach embodies your teachings.
Embodies is good. Embodies is good. Embellish, because you know, we're egomaniacs, and you should see the stuff I see that people said I said, or forms that are passed out that they said they got from my workshop, and I go, where did this come from? It's not my work.
Let me change the word embellish to illustrate.
Illustrate. Wonderful. Good. Good. Yeah.
Nicole Al-Anon.
Okay, we'll get back to Nicole from Al-Anon. I want to go to a terrific book by Marcia Engel, a physician. Book is called The Truth About Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What to Do About It. During her 2 decades at the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Marcia Engel had a front row seat on the appalling spectacle of the pharmaceutical industry. She watched drug companies stray from their original mission of discovering and manufacturing useful drugs and instead become vast marketing machines with unprecedented control over their own fortunes. She saw them gain nearly limitless influence over medical research, education, and how doctors do their jobs. She sympathized as the American public, particularly the elderly, struggled and increasingly failed to meet spiraling prescription drug prices. Now she exposes the shocking truth of what the pharmaceutical industry has become. Currently, Americans spend a staggering $200 billion each year on prescription drugs. Claims that high drug prices are necessary to fund research and development are unfounded. The truth is that drug companies funnel the bulk of their resources into the marketing of products of dubious benefit. Meanwhile, as profits soar, pharmaceutical companies brazenly use their wealth and power to push their agenda through Congress, the FDA, and academic medical centers, zeroing on hugely successful drugs like AZT and Taxol and Claritin. Dr. Engel demonstrates exactly how new products are brought to the market. Drug companies routinely rely on publicly funded institutions for their basic research. They rig clinical trials to make their products look better than they are, and they use their legions of lawyers to stretch out government-granted exclusive marketing rights for years. They also flood the market with copycat drugs that cost a lot more than the drugs they mimic but are no more effective. So, strongly recommend her work.
I have a couple things. I actually had a really great experience with one of my sponsees recently that really brought the 8th step into light. As you know, she called me and I didn't have any experience where she needed the help.
There you go.
So all I did was help her find somebody she could talk to with experience.
Yep.
I don't know all the answers for her,
Yep.
but there's a whole fellowship of people.
Absolutely.
So that's one of the ways that I can see recovery in myself, is I don't have to have all the answers anymore.
Yeah.
I want them.
Well, yeah, you want more answers and you get more answers, but
Right.
we never have all the answers.
So this is the second page.
Yes, please.
It says, now, isn't this carrying our fears of professionalism rather far? If these fears ever got too strong, none but a saint or an incompetent could work for Alcoholics Anonymous.
Right.
Our supply of saints being quite small, we would certainly wind up with less competent workers than we need.
Right.
Now, I hear the stories about the letters that would be sent, and that was how an Al-Anon meeting would be held.
All right.
Via letters. Sponsoring happened via letters in the early days, and there was no phone communication. And it would take weeks for just one communication to happen. And so they were very dependent on the literature. And so I'm between...
Here's a little something on the truth about drug companies.
So
This is
high.
Marsha
And indeed,
Engel.
for many years, the pharmaceutical industry was the most profitable industry in the United States. Number one, as far back as I could find, going right up until 2003, when the war in Iraq began. And at that point, petroleum and mining jumped ahead. Energy jumped ahead. But last year, pharmaceutical industry was still number two. The next thing to observe is how much money this industry spends on marketing and administration. Last year, that was $73 billion, or 32% of sales revenue. A lot of money. The same year, research and development accounted for only $37 billion. Now, $37 billion is a lot of money, but it's only half what these companies spent on marketing and administration, and less even than they retained in profits after all of their expenses. This is the smallest of the three main budgetary items, the smallest. Before a drug can legally be sold in this country, it has to be approved by the FDA wherever it's made. Approval depends on the company demonstrating in clinical trials that a new drug is reasonably safe and effective. But compared with what? They don't have to compare their new drugs with existing drugs to treat the same condition with the best standard treatment. In most cases, they only have to compare their new drugs with a placebo. That is the major output of this industry, and these are old drugs judged not to be any better than drugs already in the market. That is, Me Too drugs, trivial variations of drugs already in the market, and this is this industry's major output now. Well, why? Well, that's where the money is. This is just for last year, and you can see that everything was a Me Too drug. There were 93 drugs approved, 75 were Me Too drugs. There were 18 that were new molecular entities, but only 6 of those were judged to be improvements.
Okay, so you used to hear in the 1990s about how the psychiatric medications, they were simply restoring your brain's chemistry to what it should be. But that's absolute nonsense. That is not how they work. They don't just restore the mind's chemistry to a healthy state, because psychiatry, despite 100 years of efforts, has yet to find a biological basis for its diagnoses, let alone its putative cures. All right, back to the topic book from 1991, Not God, A History of Alcoholics Anonymous. So this vital spiritual experience was the third of the 4 founding moments of Alcoholics Anonymous. One half of the core idea is the necessity of a spiritual conversion had passed from Dr. Carl Jung to Roland Hazard. clothed in Oxford group practice, which the Oxford group is very different from the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was a movement within the Anglican Church towards more liturgy and tradition. The Oxford group was a movement towards practicing first century Christianity, two completely different things. And then the other vital parts of the component of the founding of AA, transmission of deflation of the self at depth, and the hope that is gained one addict, one alcoholic talking to another in that first meeting between Bill Wilson and Abby Thatcher. So now under the benign guidance of Dr. Silkworth and the profound thought of William James, the two halves joined Bill Wilson's mind to form an as yet only implicitly realized whole. Bill Wilson wrote, "Deflation at depth." Yes, that was it. Exactly that had happened to me. Dr. Carl Jung had told an Oxford group friend of Abby Thatcher's how hopeless his alcoholism was. Dr. Silkworth had passed the same sentence upon me. And Abby, also an alcoholic, had handed me the identical dose. Dr. Silkworth says so alone. Maybe I would have never completely accepted the verdict, but when Abby came along, one alcoholic began to talk to another. That had clinched it. My thoughts began to race as I envisioned a chain reaction among alcoholics, one carrying this message and these principles to the next. More than I could ever want anything else, I now knew I wanted to work with other alcoholics. So until Bill Wilson arrived at the explicit realization that whether or not he wanted to, he needed to work with other alcoholics to maintain his own sobriety. Till then, alcoholics was yet only coming into being. So two intermingled themes brought Bill Wilson to the verge of the ultimate recognized founding moment: the hopelessness of the condition of the alcoholic and the addict, and the necessity of an experience of conversion. Dr. Silkworth noted alcoholism is not just a vice or a habit, it is a compulsion, pathological craving, a disease. So in the science of medicine at the time, alcoholism was a hopeless disease. I always hated that talk of disease with regard to addiction, but the way disease, the term was used in the 1930s, quite different from today. Today we think of cancer. But back then, it was alcoholism was regarded as an obsession of the mind that condemns one to drink, an allergy of the body that condemns one to die.
The AA literature and the Al-Anon literature, I have to say I'm pretty grateful that they employ special workers.
Sure, yeah.
Because it's edited well, it's textually, visually, everything's just really well kept, and it's exactly like it says in here. If I was not paid to do this work, I'd be done.
Nobody.
Right. So words, you have to understand the meaning of words in their historical context. So disease, as used here in the 1930s, did not mean like what we mean by it today. Does not mean like a cancer diagnosis. It was the term disease back in the 1930s was akin to malady. You'd substitute the word malady for disease.
We could count on its quality.
No.
And so they make that distinction here in the middle of 87, and then we'll go on to the others. Primarily, these folks are not doing 12-step work when they're writing a pamphlet or where they're doing secretarial work at General Surface Office. It says for...
And the chat asks, is there a biological component to personality? Of course. There's a biological component, genetic component to almost all human behavior, to even political inclinations. There's a whole field of politicobiology. And so mental illness, I'm sure, does have a biological component. My point is that they haven't been able to find it yet. I believe it's there, but psychiatry, for all its boasting, has not been able to find that biological component yet.
They're on. They are just making more and better 12-step work possible. And so in the South Bay, for instance, we have a central office. Well, we have a manager of the central office. That's a paid employee to keep the office open, to receive 12-step calls. Now, the people who are receiving the 12-step calls and responding to them are all volunteers. But this woman who runs the central office orders books and distributes books and all that kind of stuff that the central office does. and that's a paid employee of the central office, which has then its own board of directors that manages that. Please.
Dave, and I'm in 2 fellowships, and neither one of them is the literature done by professional. It's all done by literature committees that review, send out revisions for review by groups or people who are interested. So that's a different experience than I have. But I had a question on the 3rd paragraph.
Okay, so there's a whole field of biopolitics. Could be said to originate with the 1968 manifesto of Albert Somit towards a more biologically oriented political science. Historical link between biology and politics and sociological organisms on the other is inescapable. The essential difference here is that the early modern application of biological ideas to politics revolved around the idea that society was a social organism, whereas the subject this article describes sets out to separate logic to human life. And I've got more on this. Let me dig it up here on my computer.
And they talk about paid intergroup secretaries. Now, our fellowship
that's just what I was mentioning.
And I just was wondering how that works in other fellowships. So,
and that's maybe the same vocabulary or nomenclature for the central office manager. That might be called an intergroup secretary. That would be the person who's running the intergroup.
Okay.
At least in my terminology.
Okay, our intergroups, I guess, are much smaller, so we do not employ paid professionals for that.
Well, we actually have one in the South Bay in Torrance, but we also have a much larger one in Los Angeles. And I didn't know that. There's one in the Valley. Yeah, okay, great. All right, so let's go to the 12 and 12. So anybody have any highlights on page 166 that they would like to comment on? Right off the bat, it says, freely you have received, freely give. And that's really the spirit of the one-on-one that we talked about.
And then almost no recovery from alcoholism has ever been brought about by the world's best professionals, whether medical or religious.
That's totally my experience. Being in a monastery for 7 years, I did not change. Being in therapy for longer than that, but also studying in the and getting a graduate education in psychology, that did not touch me. It did not change me. It was only when I came into the rooms of AA and stayed around long enough to be able to hear something that I began to then do some work and change. Let's see. Our singleness of purpose will be defeated by professionalism, and what they mean is charging for the AA work. Almost from the beginning, we have been positive that face-to-face work with the alcoholic who suffers could be based only on the desire to help and be helped. This is the work of the 12th step. I'm kind of combining a couple things. The money motive, he says, compromises the person. And also above he says money and spirituality do not mix. Now we saw that phrase in the 7th step where he says money and spirituality do not mix except in the basket. On page 167, how are we doing there? Anybody have any comments, questions, resistances? Please. Translation work, I would consider it terrible work because I couldn't translate anything. But sure, of course, it's work. Now, you can, if you want to translate, you could volunteer your time. But then I can't count on you. And I can't even count on the quality of the work or the promptness of the work. Absolutely. Absolutely. The translation for me should be paid for work. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, some is paid and some isn't.
Okay.
But it's all reviewed.
Okay, I want to go back to talking about the biological basis of political predispositions. It's an interesting book called Predisposed: Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. And one of the three co-authors appeared on Dennis Prager's radio show. And John Alford said, Professor, one of the nicest examples of the physiological finding is dealing with perception of threat. Conservatives physiologically respond much more quickly and much more dramatically to threat, even if the threat is as abstract as a burst of white noise, a startle. Startle response of conservatives is much stronger. Conservatives are much more responsive to and attentive to threatening pictures. Liberals don't physiologically respond much more to a picture of a snake than a picture of a rabbit, while conservatives attend much more quickly to the picture of the snake and respond to it. Fits with a stereotype the conservatives have of liberals that they just don't get it. It's like Obama saying we're going to Cuba because we don't know that Castro is an enemy.
And possibly by paid people.
Yeah, there you go.
So, because it's, I think there's 68 languages now that the Big Book has been translated in, but they're all approved. And there were a number of different translations early on into Spanish, and they were different.
Sure.
And so finally, there was one that was approved. Yeah. And these were approved now by the volunteers, on the...
Yeah. And here's from the book's own self-description. Even without a tumor pressing on their prefrontal cortex, individuals have varying densities of chemical receptors at key areas in the brain, differently shaped neural organs, and neurotransmitter levels in synapses that are highly variable. Effectiveness of drugs such as Ritalin and Prozac makes it clear that decisions and behaviors are biological. Artificially adjusting chemical levels in the brain affects attitudes and actions. Naturally occurring variations would have the same effect. The only way for society to function may be with a legal system that, except in the most egregious of cases, denies it is biologically more challenging for some people to do good, and that asserts that all non-clinical people are the same in terms of their ability to know right from wrong. The authors, of course, do not touch on possible biological racial differences.
General Service Board of Trustees and Literature Committee. So that's unpaid volunteers doing that, but some of the translation is done by paid people. Yeah. So it's a mix.
Well, and he says on page 167, caretakers who swept floors, cooks who fried hamburgers, secretaries in offices, authors writing books, all of these we have seen hotly assailed because they were, as their critics angrily remarked, making, this is in quotes, making money out of AA, ignoring the fact that these labors were not 12-step jobs at all. All right? They were making 12-step work possible. So there was a lot of confusion in the early days. There's very little confusion today, although there's a lot of ignorance today. All right? Which then taps right into emotions, and then people speak from places other than their brain. Nicely put, huh?
Nicole Al-Anon.
Hi, Nicole.
In case you didn't get that the last 3 times I was up here. The one thing that another thing that I really appreciate, and it was in the reading, and I've learned as being an intergroup rep, is as soon as it hits that process and it's completed, so it starts at I don't know where it starts in AA, but in Al-Anon, it starts probably in a group, then it goes to the intergroup, and then it goes to World Service. Yeah. And then it starts getting written, and then it's edited, and then it's taken back to World Service. And so it goes to the professionals within the program, but then it goes back down to the non-professionals, and the spiritual side of the things is really where the ultimate decision is made.
Yeah, so there's a tremendous vetting process, right? All right. Yes, Betsy. We're going to pass the basket. George is going to take care of that. We basically didn't make rent last week again, so it's anybody on the Big Book, but Bill had a percentage of the royalties being paid to somebody who had helped him with the Big Book preparation process. And of course, I think Bill was instrumental in writing the AA Comes of Age, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, the 12 and 12. He got royalties on all of those books. And so he ended up being a multimillionaire. Okay,
talking about Bill Wilson here, who was penniless when he started AA, And he and his family, when Bill Wilson died, he was a multimillionaire. And he got that way from the royalties to his books on the 12 steps in recovery.
As did his family at the end. And now I believe all of the royalties from all of the works go directly into AA General Service. Please.
Just a quick piece of information at $3.50, $60 today.
Oh, that's interesting. $3.50 in 1939, when the book was published. $3.50 in 1939 would be worth about $60 right now. That probably sounds about right. I know in 1956, I had my very first job. I was a sophomore in high school, and I was a gas station attendant at a service station. Remember those days? Service station, washed your windows, checked your oils, pumped your gas, 50 cents an hour. Glad to have it. It was a great job. Yep, 1956. All right. So page 168, if I've skipped anything, bring it up, but let's go to 168 and 169. Anybody have highlights on those pages that would like to comment on?
Yeah, Rob. So on 169, in the first paragraph there, it says sacks of letters. Letters must be answered by people who know, saying that we need to hire AA members to do this work because they, have the experience of recovery. But is that, if they're giving advice to other alcoholics, isn't that kind of 12-step work at that point?
Well, it's certainly a gray area marginal. Here they've obviously made a decision that people who are writing the letters are merely responding to letters that are written in.
What's the guy got to do to buy you a drink?
Okay, can't play this kind of degeneracy on my show. What are you trying to do to me, Lipped One? Right, so Dr. Silkworth, the doctor with the reputation, the little doctor who loved drunks, he saw that recovery from alcoholism was only possible on a moral basis. He declared without qualification that unless the alcoholic or the addict can experience an entire psychic change, there is very little hope for his recovery. Although Bill Wilson himself always remained wary of referring to alcoholism as a disease because he wished to avoid the medical controversy over the existence of a specific disease entity, his usual terms, illness or malady, as well as his frequent comparison of alcoholism to heart disease, bear witness to his acceptance of Silkworth's medical ideas. Later years, the widespread diffusion of the disease concept of alcoholism was largely due to Alcoholics Anonymous. And the influence of William James upon Bill Wilson and upon Alcoholics Anonymous was more complex. Reading William James's varieties of the religious experience profoundly affected Bill Wilson. The American philosopher-psychologist William James was the only author cited in the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book, in a reference having more to do with varieties than with religious experience. Here's the quote. The distinguished American psychologist William James, in his book Varieties of Religious Experience, indicates a multitude of ways in which men have discovered God. We have no desire to convince anyone that there is only one way by which faith can be acquired. Yet Bill Wilson also seemed to attribute the phrase deflation a depth to William James, even though it does not appear explicitly in William James's work. Bill Wilson, in the use he made of William James, hit upon another deep thread of the American psyche, and one that protected him and the AA program from seeming too religious. So the pluralist William James became eminently useful to the main theme of Alcoholics Anonymous. And a large part of Bill Wilson's wariness of religion lay in his horror of absolutes. Thinking absolutely about anything was, for Bill Wilson, alcoholic thinking. He described alcoholics as all or nothing people. Thus, as part of its very origins, Alcoholics Anonymous committed itself to rejection of any claim to a role as the one and only.
and it's not 12-step work, that they're giving some kind of advice and direction based on the accumulated experience. I'm not sure exactly what the protocol is there and the culture in the General Service Office, but be quite clear that they're quite clear about the difference between the professional work of a secretary who happens to be an AA person with some experience and the non-professional care that a AA person gives to another AA in terms of direction and suggestions. Yeah. But it's a wonderful observation.
Okay, let's look at a tweet here by Frank Lons. Time to raise the voting age to 45. This is because, according to MarketWatch, 36% of millennials polled say they approve of communism, up significantly from 28% in 2018. And Richard Spencer says the irony is they don't even want communism. What they want is National Socialism.
And I'm sure they're very clear on that.
Hi, Katie, all 12 steps.
Katie.
Or probably. I haven't tried them all yet. Okay. On 169, the fear will always lurk in every AA heart that one day our name will be exploited by somebody for real cash. Even the suggestion of a thing never fails to whip up a hurricane. And we discovered that it has a way of mauling with equal severity both the just and unjust. They're always unreasonable. I like that as it applies to when my life gets wrapped around money.
Right.
You know,
most everybody's does.
Yeah, because when it does, it doesn't matter if you're involved with me or not. I'll be cranky. Yeah. And I just wanted to say, the difference between the definition of professional meant something to me when I thought of sports. You know, you're paid if you're a professional, and you can't play an amateur sports. Right. And I want to always be an amateur in the 12 steps because then it's really only about my experience, and I have to learn every single time something more. I'm not in a competition.
And if you're an amateur and you're playing at college ball, it's really inappropriate for you to be driving that gift of the BMW.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Greg. I'm in three 12-step programs.
Hey, Greg.
And my question is, so if I'm a worker at a central office or whatever, I'm getting paid. If I want to stick to the principles, does that mean I still have to do, that doesn't count as 12-step work. I still have to do, if I want to live up to.
So Steve Saylor's pointing out some of the dramatic differences between New York Times today compared to 2005. New York Times in 2005 here. You realize what you're talking about is the Jews taking over America. My eyes bugged out, but then I realized that she was Jewish and she knew I was too. And between us, we could acknowledge there's a lot of truth in that statement. The New York Times published that in 2005. In a book review by David Brooks, The Chosen, Getting In, Hidden History of Admission and Exclusion at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. So a lot more real talk. The New York Times had a science editor who was a race realist. His name will come to me in a minute.
The principles I have to work 12-step work outside of my job that I get paid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's a critical question, all right, and much more relevant in the area of therapy and certified alcohol treatment programs. All right.
Okay, so the New York Times longtime science writer, science editor was Nicholas Wade. Published his book, A Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History. He's very much a race realist. He published dozens of race realist articles in the New York Times. Probably could not publish them today. The New York Times does not permit as much real talk as they used to.
Right? Where people are trained, they have degrees, they have lots of experience, and they're helping people at a professional level, and they're being paid. And the problem sometimes with the treatment credentialed people and the therapists who have the degrees, who are in program, they think that they're doing 12-step work while they're doing this work for helping people, and they're certainly helping a lot of people with their disease, but they're being paid for it. So they still, it would be a suggestion, need to go to meetings and
Okay, so David Brooks here, writing in the New York Times, 2005. The old guard at the Ivy Leagues detested the rising tide of Jews in their midst. As one Harvard alum wrote to the university's president in 1925, naturally, after 25 years, one expects to find many changes, but to find that one's university had become so Hebrewised was a fearful shock. There were Jews to the right of me, Jews to the left of me. In fact, they were so obviously everywhere that instead of leaving the yard with pleasant memories of the past, I left with a feeling of utter disgust of the present and grave doubts about the future of my alma mater. But the administrator's reaction was more interesting. People who ran these schools weren't anti-Semitic reactionaries. They were progressives. They believed in democracy and inclusion. They respected scholarly excellence embodied by the striving Jews. Yet, on the other hand, they felt that their job was to do more than pump information into the heads of hard-studying brainiacs. They sensed that mediocre students like Roosevelt really did possess a set of virtues that needed to be protected and cherished. Talking here about WASP virtues, Anglo-Saxon virtues. Thus, many of the best Ivy League administrators were torn between protecting the old and including the new. So this book doesn't just treat his narrative as a civil rights tale, a story of anti-Semitic and racist institutions slowly giving way to the forces of justice and decency. Instead, he says the history of admissions at the big three universities has been a history of recurrent struggles over the meaning of merit. As the elite universities confronted each class of applicants, they were really trying to determine which qualities of nurture and reward and which were most important for democratic citizenship. Is it just purely scholarly merit, or are there leadership skills, that ineffable combination of charisma, social confidence, decisiveness, and the ability to be part of a team? In the 1920s, the Protestant establishment still dominated business and society. University administrators in the Ivy League sensed that if they admitted too many Jews, they would alienate themselves from the power centers around them. So they restricted the number of Jews by shifting their admissions criteria, putting more emphasis on character, measured by alumni connections, athletic skill, and personal letters of recommendation. Applicants were less likely to be admitted if all they demonstrated was academic brilliance.
Need to have sponsees and need to spend free time working with their sponsees, taking them through the steps and not utilizing their degree directly in that area. All right, and so many people lose their sobriety because they get confused and they're not doing the continued service work because they they construe their professional work for their service work, and it's not the same at all. If you're making money, you're working. If you're doing your whatever labor it is for free, that's the service work. So it's critical, critical distinction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jeff, I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Jeff.
I can relate to this. My first sponsor was my therapist. So
Okay.
I came into the program after being a member, constantly going out.
Yeah.
So my therapist, got me on his path and got me to start working the steps.
Okay, here's some information about the White Settlement, Fort Worth, Texas church shooting.
Martial artists. Shootings around the nation. Pressing my video. Hacking my phone, etc. And ultimately, they are setting me up to die. And gang stalking is real. People are provoked into doing shootings. Mental health, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, the military, etc. are in on it. And it's a long story why that is, but it's something to the effect of social clubs, cults, gangs, the code of silence. It all is integrated in the greater network of corporate partners, transnational corporations that dominate society. They are ruthless. They are scientific racists. They're very concerned with reproduction and sexual behavior. They're sexual sadists. There's a lot more sex cults than people think, and these groups dominate society. They really hate black people, and they use occult word play, magic spells, sigils, if you will. For example, trap is part backwards and vice versa. Evil is lived backwards. Okay? They hung black people, lynch, Lunch, launch, and line C are connected. So is hone, haunt, hunt, and hint. So is the fact that Hades had dogs, a three-headed dog, and sometimes it's depicted as separate dogs, and they use dogs on the hunt.
Okay, so this brother tells us that vital information is being withheld as this gentleman is being harassed.
And then...
As a therapist or as a sponsor?
First as a therapist, then as my sponsor.
See, it's basically an issue of ethics. That was an unethical act. A therapist cannot have a personal relationship with his clients.
Okay. My question, I mean, I always felt a bit conflicted about it, but...
Yeah. Well, I mean, I understand the heart space, and I understand the benefit. Oh, my God, he's got credibility, he's got expertise, you're doing the dance, it's very efficient. Right. I understand it.
But so as a sponsee, I guess I felt the conflict was his.
It is his.
Is he getting pay? Is he doing it for pay or for the 12th step? As a sponsee, I'm not breaking any traditions, right? I'm
correct.
Benefiting maybe from having an experienced sponsor.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. No, the problem is his, not yours. Yep, absolutely. Page 170. Anybody have a highlight, question, comment, resistance?
Yeah, it's Rob again.
Hi, Rob.
I do have a problem here.
Okay, let me go back to this fatal shooting in the community of White Settlement in Texas. Okay, two parishioners dead, and the gunman is dead. A security member of the West Freeway Church of Christ fatally shot the gunman. Gunman opened fire at a church in Texas Sunday morning, killing 2 people with a shotgun before a member of the church's volunteer security team fatally shot him. About 250 people were inside the auditorium. And this happened and is being live streamed on across YouTube. And I see clips of the shooting all over Twitter. The gunman was acting suspiciously before the shooting drew the attention of the church's security team. Member of the security team was killed in the attack. Elder at the church said he'd known the victim on the security team for 20 years, but we do not yet know the name of the gunman. Apparently he was a transient with roots in the area, the previous arrest record, but was not on a watch list. Not clear what connection he had with the church. Okay, and
now a church shooting in Texas where one person is dead along with the suspected shooter and another is in critical condition. Texas Governor Greg Abbott responded to the shooting in a statement saying, "Our hearts go out to the victims and the families of those killed in the evil act of violence that occurred at the West Freeway Church of Christ. Places of worship are meant to be sacred, and I am grateful for the church members who acted quickly to take down the shooter and help prevent further loss of life," unquote. We want to go straight now to CNN correspondent Paul Verkaman. He is following this story for us. And Paul, I understand that there was some confusion about the initial death toll. What can you tell us?
Well, they're calling it nothing short of a miracle, Martin. That's because there were 3 patients being transported to the hospital, and all 3 were in critical condition. And from what we understand, one of those patients died. A second, who they believe was the shooter, also dead. And then this 3rd patient in what seems to be just an unbelievable incident here in a good way. They say the paramedics were furiously working on restoring a pulse, administering CPR.
Remember, if the shooter is a member of a protected group, you're not allowed to notice that or to comment on that. But if he was a Trump supporter, then you should highlight it and put that first. If he's white, if he's Christian, if he's dissident, if he's on the right, then you should definitely highlight that. But if the shooter happens to be on the left, remember, a protected group, you're not allowed to comment on that, or YouTube will delete your video.
To a patient who was described as dead. Well, it worked, and this patient, said to be a male, was revived. This according to MedStar. That's the ambulance company that was transporting the statement, and they called it nothing short of a miracle, something very, very rare in their experience when they're able to restore life to someone who they've called dead. That person transported to a local hospital.
Okay, if you get the name of the shooter at that Texas church, Please bring it to my
question,
attention.
we'll say. In the long paragraph there.
What page?
It's 170.
Good.
170. It says, in the middle, it says, unthinkingly, AAs so employed recklessly broke anonymity to thump the tub for their pet enterprise. Closer to the bottom says, yet not a single one of them had been hired to do AA's 12-step work. The violation in these instances was not professionalism at all. It was breaking anonymity.
And Glib Medley notes in the chat, all Trump supporters are potential mass shooters just waiting for Putin to give the green light. That's what much of the news media and big tech wants us to believe.
AA's sole purpose was being compromised and the name of Alcoholics Anonymous was being misused.
Yeah.
This, to me, harkens back to the very first thing that was being discussed tonight, where your experience is you go to speak to a non-AA group, you're paid a stipend, they know your name, you identify yourself as an alcoholic, you talk about your experience of recovery through the 12 steps of AA. Even if you don't say I'm a member of AA, I think they can figure out where you're a member. And so at that point, why does this paragraph not apply there? I see it's not 12-step work. But,
well, because the connotation, as I read it, is that there is some at the public level connection between AA membership and this person at the public level. That's
okay. So I'm going to play a video suggested by the chat.
I love my cousin. I was given an opportunity years ago. I was selected for an aeronautical university down south in Daytona Beach, where all the racing used to take place. Abuse victim made a special trip up north with me to asking for my help, disclosing sexual abuse by her stepdad, saying the police don't care. All my family needs to do to help is open lines of communication. My cousin coming on to me like this after I was given a drug and sent to a funeral is in the midst of prolonged harassment in my community, with the police not providing any help. Saying that I'm delusional or mentally insane does not help. It makes matters worse. Why she would agree to something like that, I know. She was hurt, and she made me cry.
The break in anonymity.
Okay. So that might be the thing that doesn't jump out so clearly to me.
Right.
That they're saying it's kind of at the level of press, media, or wider community. Because
they do say it, and it's not subtle. He was immediately tempted to use the name Alcoholics Anonymous for publicity or money-raising purposes. So that's, in fact, recklessly broke anonymity to thump the tub for his pet enterprise. He's at the public level using advertising of his relationship with AA and his membership in AA to give himself credibility. And that's just wrong. That's a break in anonymity. Okay.
So let's say the person, let's say someone just mentioned a therapist who act as a sponsor, but let's not that particularly, but the therapist or professional caregiver identifies themselves to their patient as a
member of AA
addict in order to, again, to have credibility, legitimacy, connect.
I would probably do that.
All right.
I think that's totally
not
legitimate.
Professionalism at that point.
Okay, I want to get back to this book, Not God, A History of Alcoholics Anonymous. At its very origins and most fundamental understanding, Alcoholics Anonymous has committed itself to rejection of any claim to a role as one and only. Pluralism of tolerating difference has remained important and useful to AA as its pragmatism. Especially in the early years of the fellowship, those who objected to the quote-unquote religion of AA found their attention directed to the key phrase, we have no monopoly on God. And once again, I've never been to an AA meeting. I've had the equivalent amount of alcohol as perhaps 10 glasses of wine in my entire life. So I'm not a drinker. Upon therapy for the alcoholic himself, we surely have no monopoly. It's from the big book. So it's a very pragmatic program.
I don't know the ethics of that profession. I don't know that, but it would seem to me, well, in fact, I do know that. Alan Berger doesn't at the public level. Okay. But he's, Dr. Berger, he very clearly tells people that he's 43 years sober in Alcoholics Anonymous on a personal level, because that gives him a whole level of credibility. Absolutely. It's not advertised at the public level. No, that's a one-on-one, or maybe he shares it in a group.
So I don't know. Maybe is it an issue of affiliation though? Is
affiliation is good, but it's AA. Yeah, AA affiliation. Alan Berger is not AA.
Okay.
As an organization, he's a member of AA, and that then becomes an anonymity issue.
Okay, so you can share that you're a member with pretty much anyone you want, as long as it's not at the public.
No, you can. Right. You can share your membership in AA any place in the world. I could go to Congress and do it, as long as there's not a photographer in there or is being recorded. Well, no, the reporter putting it in the paper is his job. Oh, I see what you're saying. As long as the reporter would agree that he's not going to put it in the paper. Yes, I agree.
At the AA events, which are open to the public, they make a statement at the beginning that please respect our anonymity. And, they specifically go over the anonymity principle and ask that names and photos not be published. Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Silkworth told Bill W. early on in his sobriety, look, you're having nothing but failure because you are preaching at these alcoholics. Don't talk to them about absolutes. Don't talk about your hot flash conversion experience. Bill, you've got the cart before the horse. You've got to deflate these people first. So give them the medical business and give it to them hard. Pour it right into them about the obsession that condemns them to drink and the physical sensitivity or allergy of the body that condemns them to go mad or die if they keep on drinking, coming from another alcoholic, one alcoholic talking to another. Maybe that will crack those tough egos deep down. So one of the keys to 12-step recovery is shared vulnerability. Only then can you begin to try out your other medicine, the ethical principles that you picked up from the Oxford groups. So go back to a powerful share here from good old Craig F.
If it works for you, that's fine. This is only me. This is only my experience. I can't tell you. I mean, if you're new, the usual disclaimer applies. This is only what's happened to me. For a lot of people, it's different, and auras really help, and all that stuff really helps. I don't hang out with them or anything, but I was frightened. I was scared. I wanted something to take away my fear. At the core of me, the core of my problem, self-centered fear. I'm either not going to get what I want or I'm going to lose what I've got. And when I can't figure out how that's going to happen, I start inventing ways. I'm going to lose my mind. I'm going to drink. It's going to all be tomorrow or something. I don't keep it in the day. And I went to this doctor who had been recommended to me. He's 15 years sober. I don't know his name or I'd tell you, but I can't remember it. But he said to me, we're going to do some tests on you. And I think maybe you should go on some kind of thing. And he said maybe some kind of medication. And as he was saying it, I started to think, because he said a phrase, that's it. He said, this doesn't sound like normal alcoholism to me. And I started to think, who the fuck are you to know that? What the fuck do you know is normal alcohol? What is normal alcoholism anyway? And I was glad when I started to think that, because I thought, I'm coming back. You know what I mean? I'm going back to AA. I can hear myself in a meeting, and suddenly it felt all right. I was scared. I realize that now. I was terrified. And I didn't know how to articulate it in meetings. And I learned a great lesson. That I started going to meetings again in a way that I had never gone to them, maybe ever in all the time I'd been in AA. I just started sharing, not knowing what the fuck I was going to say. It's because I had to have you hear me. I had to have you hear me say, I'm scared. What what the fuck's going on? I don't know what's happened to me. I've not had a drink. Nothing should be wrong, but I'm fucking dying. What's wrong with me? And I started going to meetings and sharing that. And people...
So my sponsor gave me a very powerful exercise. Write out my fear, say, of a fear of learning new technology. Then write out how this fear serves me, so it incentivizes me to concentrate on things that I do well to avoid wasting my efforts. Then write about how does this fear hurt me, so it limits my ability to learn, it limits my ability to be of service, it limits my ability to be prosperous and to earn, it fills me with unnecessary fear. And then write about how it would serve me to instead come with the attitude of faith in God, faith in the program, love and generosity. And that way, with that attitude, I was able to learn OBS streaming, to do the new technology with this show starting about 6 months ago. And it's helped me deal with all of my fears. So using that methodology, right? Get specific about the fear, get specific about how the fear serves me, get specific about how the fear hurts me, and then get specific about how I'd benefit coming with an attitude of faith, love, and generosity. And I'm talking here about fear that's disproportionate to reality. I'm not talking here about healthy, rational levels of fear. Okay, so this is neurophilosopher Thomas Metzinger dropping black pills on normies. Says, Ashi, let's play some of this. Here we go.
It's helped me to reach that goal if I've made a decision of how I want to die.
If one realizes that the so-called self is nothing more or than a bunch of neurological processes, doesn't it create a kind of moral no man's land? You know, first God was taken away as shown to be an illusion, and then now the self is a kind of illusion. And I think that people will become more fundamentalist.
Yes, I think you are very right in what you're saying. Many people don't see this. I think humanity is going through a bottleneck, through a historical bottleneck, and it has two main components. One is, on the outside, we have climate change, and in the next centuries, we're going to have a crisis in the outside world that is completely new, and that doesn't go away. So we will realize that we are failing beings. We know about climate change, and we cannot change our behavior. But then all the science comes us and says there's really no self, no sharp identity, and this will hurt people emotionally. There are scientists and intellectuals who think this is no problem and they discuss about it, but we should never forget that more than 80% of the 7 billion people on this planet are deeply living in religious, metaphysical images of man, and they are not ready for this. They have never heard of a neural correlate of consciousness, and they don't want to hear about it, and they have never heard about a self-model, and many of them don't want to hear about it. And the information also comes just out of those countries that have colonized and oppressed them in the past. It's a very tricky situation. So
okay, that's Thomas Metzinger on choosing a different personality. When I go back to the title book, Not God, A History of Alcoholics Anonymous. Any city can be a lonely place for a traveling man, and grimy Akron was no exception. On Saturday, 11th of May, the day before Mother's Day, Bill Wilson moped in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel in downtown Akron. This is 1935. He began to pace. At one end of his lobby track, the bar gleamed dimly as it filled with late Saturday afternoon revelers. At the other, Bill noted with little interest, stood the hotel church directory. As he paced, the friendly buzz from the bar grew louder, began to impinge on his self-pitying consciousness. God, he thought, I'm going to get drunk. And in that thought began the final founding moment of Alcoholics Anonymous. For at that instant, Bill Wilson panicked. Never before had he panicked at the thought of a drink. One idea rose out of all his recent intensive experience. I need another alcoholic. Bill Wilson turned on his heel, purposefully striding away from the bar towards the church directory. started calling people saying he needed to get in touch with alcoholics that he could talk to about his recovery experience. Finally, he got in touch with Henrietta Seibling, told her his story, and she said, "Oh, you need to meet Dr. Bob." Dr. Bob apparently tried all the medical cures, all the religious approaches, including the Oxford group, yet he could not stay sober. So Bill sat down with Dr. Bob, and he began by telling Dr. Bob Smith, the tale of his own experiences with alcohol, the hopes, the promises, the failures, the drinking camaraderie in hotel rooms, the painful drying out, the loving devotion of his wife, how she had to take a clerk's job to support his boozing. And he came to Dr. Silkworth's diagnosis of obsession, compulsion, and physical allergy. Bill laid it on. Then he told of Ebby Thatcher's visit and his simple message, "Show me your faith, and by my works I will show you mine." Dr. Bob studied Bill Wilson, and here was someone who knew the score. This is someone who had been there, someone who had felt the obsession of craving, the terrors of withdrawal, the self-hatred over failure, all the things that he, Dr. Robert Smith, had experienced and was experiencing even as he listened. Something happened within Dr. Bob, and he realized that he needed to make this profound spiritual change. This stranger from New York, Bill W., hadn't preached at him. He'd simply told him the jury but fascinating facts about himself and his own drinking. And at the end of his talk, he thanked Dr. Bob for listening. And that's another of the important founding moments for AA.
Yeah. Dave?
What about the author that in their book blurb says, 22 years sober from whatever? Do they break anonymity because you say, well, they're sober from alcohol, they must be in AA or something like that?
But that's a conclusion, not an advertising.
But if they said they were 20 years sober in AA, that would be a violation?
That would be a violation. Now, that's a pretty, that's a fine hair, isn't it? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And anybody who would read my book, even though I don't mention I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, I mean, they would have to be pretty dense not to know that. So page 171 wraps it up on this particular angle. Our 12th step is never to be paid for. Could that be any clearer? But those who labor in service for us are worthy of their hire. I just love that. The 12-step work, never to be paid for. The service to support and enable 12-step work can be paid for. Doesn't mean it has to be paid for, but can be.
Yeah, there's a spiritual axiom that we need to give it away to keep it.
Yeah.
Not sell it to keep it.
Yeah, give it away to keep it. It doesn't make any sense. It's that paradox that we experience. You can't give what you don't have, and to the extent that you have it, you can keep it if you give it away. What?
Milton Alanon. Why was there such a big thing about anonymity back then?
For two reasons. The first reason was that there was such a small group of people that were managing the office, they didn't want to be overwhelmed. And number two, there was such a stigma in society that they didn't want to be associated with those people. All right? That was the original. And then once Bill Wilson studied the Washingtonians, which had risen to incredible heights in 4 years, 400,000 people, or 300 or 400,000 people in 4 years. And there's Bill Wilson in 4 years with 100 people, and that's a stretch. All right? And the Washingtonians had disappeared in 10 years. They were gone. So much so that Bill never even heard of them 100 years later. All right? He did not want to happen to AA what had happened to them, and one of the major reasons they blew up, the Washingtonians, is that they began self-promotion. They began looking for the headlines. They began because they thought it would be good for their business, for their cause. And that kind of egomania, which is somewhat foreign to alcoholics, right, would be the death of us, literally.
Okay, guys, keep coming back. It works.